This case is called the West Memphis 3. This case sparked so much conspiracy after an HBO documentary. I still feel like I don't know what happened. I'm gonna give you all the facts to let you come to a decision on your own. Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name's Francesca. This is my space where I tell you a new true crime story every single week. If you're obsessed with true crime like me, I recommend you subscribe because I'm always here for you with a new story. Now let's get into the case. On May 5th, 1993, 3 sets of parents had called the West Memphis Police Department to say that their 3 8-year-old sons were missing. The first was John Mark Byers, and he reported his son Christopher to be missing. They said that they had last seen Chris at 5:30 in their yard. The next call came from Dana Moore, who said that her son Michael had gone off to ride bikes with his friends. That was around 6 o'clock. And he had not come back. And then the third call was made by Pamela Hobbs, who said she hadn't seen her son Stevie since he left for school. Having these 3 young boys missing immediately set off alarm bells with the police and the town. There were woods called Robin Hood Hills, and it was near Interstate 40. This is where the neighborhood kids used to play. And this is where the police decided to search for the boys. The woods had about 40 acres of land, and they had searched all night that night, but they hadn't found anything. An important person in this case is Gary Gitchell, who was the chief inspector. He's going to be very important in this investigation, so please remember his name. Since nothing came up in the search the night prior, Gary said that he would go and search the next morning for the boys. That same day, an officer named Steve Jones saw a black tennis shoe in the water in a ditch in the woods. That same day, there were 2 other children found naked with their wrists bound and their ankles bound with shoelaces. Chris Byers was found with his scrotum gone and his private area skinned. The neighbors in the town were so invested in this case that when the police had put up a crime scene, that they were all gathered around outside the edge of the woods. And this is where Inspector Gitchell walked to the crowd and explained what was happening. Stevie's stepdad was in that crowd, and he had just fell to his knees and began sobbing. After the news got out, there were rumors spreading around the town that this was the work of devil worshippers. Inspector Gitchell let these rumors circulate around the town. When interviewed by the media, Inspector Gitchell also told them that they were starting to investigate the possibility that the murders were connected with cult activity. There was a teenager named Damien Eccles who was 17 years old, and he was considered a troubled teen in the town. He even had a juvenile officer named Jerry Driver. Damien was a high school dropout who had a history of psychiatric problems, including major depression. To give a physical description of what Damien looked like, he always dressed in black, he wore his hair really long, he had a tattoo on his upper arm, and he described himself as a Wiccan. He would even write dark poems from time to time in his journal. A Wiccan describes himself as someone that follows the religion of Wicca, and it's a form of paganism. And it goes by the cycles of nature and the changing seasons. They usually practice magic for healing and personal growth. Damien had an ex-girlfriend who he had threatened, as well as her current boyfriend and the current boyfriend's family. In 1992, Damien had been staying with his mom in Oregon for a few months, and he was admitted to a psych ward there and placed under suicide watch. He had returned to Arkansas in the fall, and he was placed in a juvenile detention center. He wouldn't last there long since he ended up biting and attempting to suck the blood of an inmate. From there, he was transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Little Rock. After he was let go from the hospital, he went back to West Memphis, and he met regularly with a social worker at a mental health center. The social worker had reported that Damien could end up being another Charles Manson or Ted Bundy. After knowing all of Damien's history and how he was and what he was like, his juvenile officer, Jerry Driver, ended up convinced that Damien might have something to do with the murder of the 3 boys. With the suspicion, he reported it to the police department. And on May 7th, Damien was brought in for questioning about the murders. He said he had never heard of the 3 boys and called the police who committed the murders sick. He said he spent the night of May 5th at home with his mother, and he was on the phone with his 2 girlfriends. The police questioned Damien 3 times. One was at the police station where they brought him in, and then the other 2 times was at his home in the trailer park. The police officer questioning him stated that the killer is probably someone local and that he won't run. He noted that Damien liked to read books about Stephen King, and he had evil written on his left knuckles. The police had asked Damien to take a polygraph test, and he ended up taking it, and they found that there were significant responses indicative of deception. They thought Damien was lying to them. But also from this test, they ended up looking at one of Damien's friends Jason Baldwin, who also had evil written on his left knuckles. They had brought Jason in for questioning, and he also denied being involved with the murders, but the detectives were not convinced at all. Actually, Jason's interview made them look into him even more. During their investigation, a local waitress named Vicky Hutchinson had approached the police and told them that she could help them. She said that from time to time, she would sometimes hire Jesse Miss Kelly, who was also a local teenager, and she said that she would hire him to babysit and to mow her yard. She said that Jesse was friends with Damien and that this would give her an in the investigation. She said that she has suspicions that the murders were cult related. Vicky told police that Jesse had a really low IQ and that he said that his friend Damien liked to drink blood and stuff. Surprisingly, the police agreed to have Vicky help with the investigation, and so she asked Jesse to introduce her to Damien because she was romantically interested in him. So Jesse brings Damien over to her house and then they get acquainted. Later that month, Vicky and her 8-year-old son Aaron go down to the police station and share their stories. Aaron had told authorities that he and the 3 murdered boys would often go to Robin Hood Hills, and that on one visit to the woods they saw 5 men sitting in a circle chanting and doing what men and ladies do. Vicky, who was doing her own personal investigation, tells her story to the police. Vicky told police that on the night of May 19th, her, Damien, and Jesse all went down to what they call an SBAT, which is considered a gathering of witches, in a field right outside of town. She said that there at the SBAT were 10 young people. They had their faces and arms covered in black paint. She said that they had stripped their clothes off and began to touch each other. Right off the bat, what's off with the story is that Damien was never known to have driven a car, nor had he ever owned a car. But her story continues, and she said that the ones participating in the orgy used nicknames like Spider, Snake, and Lucifer. Vicky said that she felt uncomfortable and she had asked Damien to leave, which they end up doing, and leave Jesse back at the field. On June 2nd, the police end up using a polygraph on Vicky, and the polygraph administrator said that her story was true. After the results came out, the police were convinced that they had their murderer. They end up picking up Jesse from his house at 9 in the morning, and they tell him that there was a $35,000 reward for information leading to the murders of the 3 young boys. Jesse came from a more humble family, and so the police tempted him with saying that if he helped them with the murders, that his family would end up getting the reward money. So Jesse agrees, and he does a polygraph test, and in the polygraph test they ask questions about being involved in satanic rituals, which he denied. And he also denied knowing anything about the murders, but the detectives thought that Jesse was lying completely. After hours of questioning, Jesse begins to tell the officers that him, Damien, and Jason committed the murders. It was basically what the police wanted to hear after questioning him for hours and hours. Later, Jesse was asked about this experience at the police station, and he said that, "I kept telling the police that I didn't know who did it. I just knew of it, what my friend had told me, but they kept hollering at me. They kept saying that I knew I had something to do with it, because other people had told them. After I told them what the 3 boys were wearing, Gary Gitchell told me were any of them tied up. That's when I went along with him. I repeated what he told me. I said yes, they were tied up. He asked what were they tied up with. I told him a rope. He got mad. He told me, "Jesse, don't mess with me." He said no, they were tied up with shoestrings. I had to go through the story again until I got it right. They hollered at me until I got it right. So whatever he was telling me, I started to tell him back. But I figured something was wrong, because if I'd killed them, I would have known I'd done it. There were a lot of inconsistencies between Jesse's story and the truth. One of these being that Jesse said that the murders occurred in the day, but the murders occurred at night, and that the boys were tied up with rope and not shoelaces. 5 hours after picking Jesse up, they finally got a confession. In the taped confession, Jesse states that while he was in Robin Hood Woods with Damien and Jesse, he watched Damien hit Chris Byers in the head with his fist and bruised him up real bad. And then Jason turned around and hit Steve Branch. Then the other one took off. Michael Moore took off running. So I chased him and grabbed him and held him until they got there, and then I left. Jesse said that when he returned to the scene minutes later, all the 3 boys had their clothes off and were tied up. They started screwing them and stuff, cutting them and stuff, and I saw it, and I turned around and looked, and then I took off running. I went home, then they called me and asked me how come I didn't stay. I told them I just couldn't. After having Jesse's confession, the prosecutor for the state ends up getting warrants for the homes of Jesse, Damien, and Jason. And on June 3rd of 1993, at 10:30 p.m., all the 3 boys were arrested and they were charged with 3 counts of capital murder. The next morning, there was a press conference of the arrest, and Gary Gitchell gets up to talk to the media. When he was asked how confident he felt about this case, from a scale of 1 to 10, he said 11. The police wanted to make their case even stronger, and they end up re-interviewing Vicky's son, Aaron. Aaron had told the police that he was actually in the woods with the 3 boys and that he saw their murders. He said that he got a call the night prior from Jesse, telling him to meet him in the woods with his friends and that they would do stuff together. Aaron said that he had showed up with his 3 friends and that Jesse, Jason, and Damien slapped his friends. He said that when the boys slapped his friends, he ran away and Jesse caught him, but he ended up getting away and then Jesse caught him again. He said that Jesse tied him up and that 40 seconds later, he had untied him. This was a very descriptive answer. Gary Gitchell asked Aaron how he was tied up, and Aaron said with a rope. Aaron tells the police that they could not hurt me because I kicked every one of them with the foot, but that his friends had gotten stabbed and they had their clothes taken off. He said that they cut off his private spot and that they saw the 3 teens assault the 3 young boys. Gary Gitchell felt amazing now having an 8-year-old as his eyewitness. It became very evident that Jesse had a lower IQ and that he actually was tested to have an IQ of a 7-year-old at the age of 17. This would technically make Jesse mentally handicapped, and because of this, on August 4th of 1993, Judge Burnett had ruled that Jesse should have a different and separate trial from the 2 other boys, Damien and Jason. The judge had also ruled that Jesse's confession from the police would also be used and allowed in court, even though the prosecutors had claimed that it was made under false and coercive circumstances. The last ruling that the judge made was that the boys should be all tried as adults and not juveniles, even though they were under 18. On January 19th, 1994, it was time for Jesse's trial, with his defense attorney, David Stidham, and the judge, David Burnett. Jesse's trial had a jury of 7 women and 5 men. The first witnesses for the trial were the mothers of the 3 boys, describing how and when their sons went missing. The prosecution team ends up showing the jury the pictures of how the 3 boys were found. They were white, bound, and mutilated. Inspector Gary Gitchell was called up to the stand. He ends up describing Jesse's confession and that Jesse was calm throughout the whole interrogation. Then the prosecution team plays Jesse's confession for the court to hear. As the jury was listening to the tape, there were a lot of differences between Jesse's confession and the truth. For example, that the murders were committed at noon, and also that the boys were bound with brown rope. Gitchell tells the court that Jesse was just confused. Vicky goes up on the stage and gives her testimony, saying that she was motivated to get involved in the case because she loved the boys and she wanted to see their killers get caught. She ends up telling the court about her experience going to the SBAT with Damien and Jesse, and that she saw 12 to 15 young people at the gathering. In the trial, we find that there is actually really no evidence connecting Jesse to the murders. Even someone from the state crime lab had testified that there was a green polyester fiber found on a Cub Scout cap of one of the boys, and it was microscopically similar to the fibers found on a shirt in Damien's house, and that a red rayon fiber found near the bodies was microscopically similar to the fiber of a red bathrobe found in Jesse's home. She even admitted that the fibers did not directly connect the murderers to the crime scene, but that it could have been a secondary transfer instead. The judge ruled that Jesse's polygraph test was not to be used in trial because of Arkansas's law. Because of this, the prosecution team had brought in the polygraph administrator, and he told the court that all the answers that Jesse gave were truthful, except for one about his prior drug use. A social psychologist, Dr. Afshay, was brought into the courtroom. He came to testify that Jesse had given the police a false statement because he could not deal with the strain of the interrogation. He told the court that people with low self-esteem or that are mentally handicapped are more at risk of giving false confessions because they can't handle the strain of interrogation, and they tend to respond more to coercive and overly persuasive tactics. However, Dr. Afshay was not allowed to dissect the confession of Jesse as well as the police's interrogation tactics. So with that, Jesse's trial had ended, and the final verdict was that he was guilty of first degree on all 3 accounts. Jesse was then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After Jesse was sentenced, it was time for Damien and Jason's trial. After his sentencing, Jesse had made the decision that he was not going to testify against Damien or Jason. Unfortunately, this was going to make it tough for the prosecution because they only had little circumstantial evidence. The boys were also being tried together because the judge denied them having separate trials. The prosecution was hoping that Damien's connection with witchcraft would automatically make Jason guilty by association. The start of the trial starts the same way that Jesse's did, with the parents describing how and when their kids went missing. But this time they also described the way that their boys were found. One of the detectives was put on the stand and he was asked about a 2-month delay about one of the pieces of evidence that was found at the crime scene. The detective said that he hadn't taken this piece of evidence into the crime scene lab because he was only ordered to do so after Jesse's confession. This was immediately objected, and this is where they asked for a mistrial. They said that saying that Jesse had made a confession was prejudicial and unwarranted. But the judge basically said everyone knows that Jesse made a confession, so move on, and he denied the motion. The detective said that in the interrogation, Damien had told him that every person holds demonic forces in them. He said that Damien would make statements about the mystical significance of water, and he noted that the number 3 was significant in the Wicca religion. He said that Damien was known to read books written by Stephen King, who we all know was a horror novelist. This was just to give the impression to the court that Damien was involved in weird things. The prosecution then calls up Damien's ex-girlfriend, the one who he had threatened. She was telling the court that Damien always dressed in black and that he always had knives in his trench coat. Then an officer described the search of Damien's home, and he said that what had turned up were 11 black t-shirts, the book Never on a Broomstick, and the skull of a dog. The prosecution team had also asked the court to take note that May 5th, when the young boys were murdered, it was a full moon that night. A Dr. Dale Griffiths, who is a cult expert from Ohio, was called up to the stand. He said that the number 3 was one of the most significant numbers in the practice of satanic belief. He said that the murders of the 3 boys could have been the trappings of occultism. The trappings would have included the removing of the blood and the phase that the moon was in at the night of the murder. When he was asked about the significance of the sucking of the blood, he said that blood is a life force and that the younger, the more powerful it is. There was a knife discovered behind the lake of Damien's house, and this was given to a medical examiner who was then put on the stand. He said that the wounds on Chris Byers' body were consistent with the serrated portion of the knife that was found. However, what was a bit strange, John Mark Byers, who was the stepfather to Chris, he had a similar knife that was also consistent with the wounds on Chris's body. The doctor said that Chris's wounds and the damage done to his private area was done while he was still alive. He also said that there were blows to Stevie and Michael's heads, and that Michael's lungs were filled with water, meaning that while he was in that lake, he was still breathing. One of the prosecution's witnesses was an inmate that had gotten to know Jason in jail, and he said that Jason had admitted to dismembering the kids and that he sucked blood from them. This inmate also said that he is only coming forward now because he was heartbroken seeing the parents of the 3 boys. The only physical evidence that the police had connecting Damien to the murder was a trace of blue wax that was found on the shirt of one of the murdered boys, and that same polyester fiber recovered from the Cub Scout cap that was mentioned in Jesse's trial. This was the one that was microscopically similar to the shirt that was found in Damien's home. The prosecution finished their trial by bringing in 2 girls who said that they had overheard Damien at one of the sports games from school saying that he had killed the 3 boys and that he was not done and he would kill again. Damien ends up taking the stand, and he was asked about his interests, his life story. He likes skateboarding, movies, talking on the phone, and reading. Damien was asked about his focus on the Wicca religion, and he said it was basically a close involvement with nature. He said that he wasn't a Satanist, that he didn't believe in human sacrifices or anything like that. He was asked about why he had a skull in his bedroom, and he said that it just kind of looked cool. He gave the same answer when he was asked about the word evil tattooed on his knuckles and why he always wore black. Damien said that he was kind of self-conscious about what he wore, and someone had once told him that he looked good in black. This was the team strategy, as kind of showing Damien as just a different kind of teenager. Damien then denies having anything to do with the murders and that he actually didn't know about them until he saw it on the news. Gary Gitchell was questioned by the defense team, asking about the video camera and the audio recorders that they have, but that they didn't use during any of the interviews with Damien. He really had no answer for this. This was a weird part in the trial, but Chris Byers' stepfather, who we've heard a bit about now, was also brought up to the stand, and he had given an HBO film crew that was doing a documentary about the murders, he had given them like a knife, the same knife that they brought in the other court case. When they looked into the knife, there was actually some blood on the knife, and John said that it was just kind of like from a cut on his finger. But previously, he had told the police that he had no idea how human blood ended up on his knife. On March 17th, the jurors had their verdict. Both defendants, Damien and Jason, were guilty of capital murder in the deaths of all three boys. The jurors decided to sentence Jason to life in prison without possibility of parole, and that Damien should actually die by lethal injection. Jason was transported to the penitentiary at Pine Bluff, and Damien was brought to the state's maximum security prison in Varner, Arkansas, to begin his life on death row. After the ruling was done for all three boys, their attorneys each filed appeals to the Arkansas Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ends up upholding all three convictions. But this was not the end of the controversy surrounding this case. In 1996, HBO aired a documentary called Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, and they were infamously known as the West Memphis 3. The film ended up creating this type of movement, and there was actually a website created to have the boys released. This was all due to the fact that the film, in a way, suggested that the killer could be John Mark Byers, Chris's stepdad. In 2003, Vicky, the waitress who had an in with Jesse and Damien and who wanted to help the investigators, had actually retracted her statement and said a decade later and said that everything she told them was a lie. She said that she felt that she needed to comply with the police or else that they would take her son away. Another thing that poked a hole in this case was that in 2007, the DNA that was found at the crime scene was retested, and none of it actually belonged to Damien, Jason, or Jesse. This new DNA evidence did not convince Judge Burnett to reopen the trial. Then on November 4th, 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court had announced an opinion to retest and reconsider the new DNA evidence. The three had to decide if they were going to enter an Alford plea, which is essentially to plead guilty but maintain their innocence. The prosecutor had wanted all three of them to take this plea, or else that there would be no deal and that they would not be released. Jason had finally agreed to the deal, and so he took the plea. Because of this, Jason, Jesse, and Damien were all released. Later, a documentary film called The West Memphis was released in 2012. This film had suggested that Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of Stevie Branch, which was one of the young boys, had participated in the murder of the three victims. The film shows that there was a significant amount of evidence connecting Terry to the crime scene. There was DNA and a hair found in one of the shoelaces that was used to tie up the boys. This matched Terry, and there was a second hair found on a tree stump near where the bodies were found that matched David Jacoby, who was a friend of Terry's. In the film, it was also noted that Hobbs had this history of abusive behavior. He had assaulted his wife, and he had beat his child. He also had assaulted one of his neighbors. There was also an eyewitness testimony in the film that Terry had gone to do laundry the night of the murders, and he was cleaning mud off of his clothes. This apparently was after he had committed the murders. Stevie, the little boy, had a knife that he would carry around like a prized possession, and this was found in Terry's things at home. What was a supposed story of that night was that Terry and his friend David were driving around, they were smoking pot, they were drinking, and they had told these two teenagers to start wrestling, and then slowly this wrestling turned into like some type of sexual activity with also Terry and David. And it was during this activity that the 3 little boys had seen what Terry and the others were doing. And because of this, they end up chasing after the boys and beating them. This is where all the assault on the boys that was found on the crime scene happened. They had cut one of their private parts, they had bit their private area, they had beat it, and they had taken the boys' clothes off. They were dragged to the water, and then their bikes were also thrown into the bayou. The police had actually heard about this story from a phone call of someone that had supposedly heard about it, and they actually just brushed it off, and the person who called never got a call back. Terry was never arrested. No one who was supposedly involved in the murders was arrested, but the 3 who were are now free, and we want to know, where are the Memphis 3 now? Damien now lives in Salem, Massachusetts with his wife Lori. Jesse now works in West Memphis, but he actually is one to not talk to the media after he was released. And Jason actually teaches inmates in prison, and he helped produce a feature film about the West Memphis case called Devil's Knot. This movie starred Reese Witherspoon. He says he hopes to attend law school one day. This case took me on so many twists and turns, and there was so much information, so many different stories, so many different accounts, and then to have everything kind of unravel itself with a film made by HBO is kind of crazy. But this movement took such a big part, I think, in their release and having their names cleared. Even if they're not technically cleared, I think we can all kind of come to our understanding and our own thoughts about the case. I personally don't know what to believe. There's a lot of things that don't make sense in this case, and I think having everything slowly unravel, it's kind of hard to decide what's true and what's not. What is true is that there were 3 little boys that became victims, and they should be the ones that we remember, as well as the West Memphis 3, who, if they were wrongfully convicted, also deserve to have their names cleared, and in a way they were also victims as well. I hope you guys enjoyed the story. This was a whirlwind. If you've heard of this case and if you have any ideas or thoughts, please leave them in the comments. I love to hear them. If you have any stories that you want me to cover, please let me know, and I'll see you guys in my next video.